Hello and welcome to my first speaking video, and sorry for my obvious bad English, but let's jump to the video. Even though the contact with Czechs and Germans are much older than I will discuss today, we have to start here because it's the era of urbanization and generally speaking a state building time. 13th century, it's very important for our topic. The fashionable German influence penetrates the main aristocratic classes and many families started to Germanize their names. Like for example Vítkovci to such names as Rosenbergs. This was due to a cultural influence from the German lands, which was seen as the higher culture compared to the local one. Castles were also given German names, as it was believed that the castles with German names were impregnable. At the time, the Germans had mostly lived at the court of king, or worked as medieval artists or merchants. The Czech population, the majority of Bohemia, however, until now had lived only in the lowlands alongside the rivers and had mostly avoided forested areas. However, the first German settlements were spontaneously established in the borderlands. It was not until the late Přemyslids and especially Otakar I. The ethnic Germans came at the invitation of the Czech monarchs to cultivate the sparsely or completely unpopulated Czech border area. The Czechs had no experience with life in the mountainous areas, and the arriving Germans settled there, cleared the forests, fertilized the soil, and generally successfully farmed there. Many inhabitants of Bohemian cities spoke both Czech and German at the time. Given that we cannot count on every widespread national consciousness, especially in the 13th century and the first half of the 14th century, this means that these bilinguals were neither Germans nor Czechs. The situation is even more complicated by the fact that even the Germans did not speak the same language in the Bohemian environment. There were, quite significantly, different dialects depending on where each immigrant came from. It is interesting that immigrants came to Bohemia mainly from more populated regions like Bavaria, Saxony, or remote corners such as Frisia. Even if we wanted to determine the origin of the inhabitants by their names, the results are not definitive and may rather confuse us. For individual townspeople, we can find both Czech and German forms in the records. But due to the intense immigration of Germans, it's more likely that in the 13th century most were Germans. This part of the history of urban life is very interesting and begins in the second half of the 14th century, mostly due to the Charles IV, who established Czech language as one of the official languages in the empire and continued to cultivate the local population mainly by the University of Prague. From the year 1355, we have the first documented report of the national disputes in the Bohemian cities. For example, Charles IV at the time issued a charter for the city of Beroun in Bohemia, in which he stipulated that half of the Germans and half of the Czechs should sit in the local city council. The Czech community was so strong in Beroun, even among the wealthy townspeople, that it claimed representation in the city council. It can be also assumed that the Czech national consciousness was already widespread among the townspeople at the time. The major Czechization of cities expanded considerably during the second half of the 14th century and at the beginning of the 15th century. Now you are probably asking how such drastic change in events actually happens. The first was the plague epidemic that ravaged Europe in the 14th century. The most terrible of this, the so-called Black Death, avoided most of the Bohemian crown lands. However, it is likely that its rampage in Germany greatly limited the influx of immigrants to Bohemia, which significantly contributed to the development of Czech consciousness in larger cities. The second turning point was the development of the Czech as a cultural language from the 14th century and the establishment of Czech as a language of communication between the nobility and the higher clergy. For example, if the wealthy burghers wanted to move in the higher circles, they had to know Czech. Likewise, if they bought property in the countryside and needed to communicate not only with their subjects, but also with the surrounding nobility. Czech also became necessary for merchants and craftsmen who had contact with the noble customers. Thus, Bohemian cities were being Czechized from below and above. The last thing was the penetration of the national consciousness into the burgher environment, which limited the adaptation to the German majority in many cities. Under these conditions, long before Hussite Revolution, the Czechs gained majority both among the population and among the members of the city councils in many important cities such as Plzeň, Slaný, Louny, Hradec Králové, and all the cities of Prague, and many others. Czechs asserted themselves in the city administration structure and ultimately gave the city a completely or almost a Czech character within majority of the cities in the Bohemian heartland. This was the state which conserved until the 30-year War in the 17th century.